Excuse me, sir. You can't go past this point without an HOA vehicle decal, she shouted, standing dead center on the gravel road with arms flared like a traffic cop, a clipboard in one hand and a Starbucks iced coffee in the other. Behind her, her Lincoln Navigator sat parked diagonally across the only road to my ranch, tires angled, doors locked, and hazard lights flashing like it was auditioning for a low-budget disaster film. I slowed my truck, rolled down the window, and calmly asked, "Karen, are you sure you want to do this?" But it was too late. Somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable rumble of an M1 Abrams tank echoed through the canyons, shaking the dust off the mesquites. Her expression morphed from smug to confused to horrified as she shrieked, "What is that noise? Are those helicopters?" And then the ground began to vibrate. Karen Dobbins Winterford had only lived on the edge of our quiet Texas county for 3 months, but somehow, she had already declared herself the de facto president of an HOA that never existed. The closest thing we had to a homeowners association out here was a local rattlesnake who liked to hang out under my porch steps. But that didn't stop Karen from creating laminated warning signs, color-coded violation tags, and what she called property wellness inspections, which was really just her snooping with binoculars from her porch while sipping overpriced iced teas. She'd harassed my neighbor, Jed, for keeping a rooster. She ticketed my goats, yes, goats, for being too expressive. And now, she decided to block the only road that led to my ranch because I didn't have a sticker that matched her fictional HOA guidelines. I was trying my best to avoid any drama. That morning had started off perfectly. I was sipping coffee, listening to the gentle hum of cicadas, and watching my goats chase each other around the field like clumsy toddlers in fur coats. Then I got the text. "Convoy ETA 60 minutes. Be ready." It was from Major Collins. That's when I remembered. Today was the start of the military exercise I had agreed to host on my land. An experimental joint forces training scenario involving helicopters, tanks, and personnel carriers. I had cleared the path days in advance. No neighbors, no livestock in the way. Everything was ready. Everything except Karen. As I pulled my truck up to her barricade, I gave her one last chance to move her navigator. "Karen," I said as gently as possible, "this road is about to become federal property for the next 24 hours. You don't want to be here when that convoy comes through." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought she might pass out. "This is a residential zone and I don't see a neighborhood sticker. You have no authorization to pass. If you want to appeal your violation, you may submit a written request to the HOA Grievance Board." She pointed at herself. "That's me." She turned on her heel, marched back to her SUV, and plopped herself inside like she just won a court case. I sat there for a beat, considering my options. Calling the sheriff might help, but we were on a tight schedule. And besides, this was technically my road. My land. Her SUV was trespassing. That's when I heard it, the low thunder of rotor blades in the sky. The whine of turbines. I looked toward the ridge line and spotted the first Apache gunships circling overhead. The tank wouldn't be far behind. I reached for my radio and called in to the lead convoy unit. "This is Ranch Point," I said. "We've got a civilian obstruction on the road. Do you want me to clear it manually or?" "Requesting clearance to proceed," came the reply in that cold, no-nonsense tone only the military can deliver. I looked back at Karen. She had climbed onto the hood of her navigator and was now recording herself with her phone. "I am documenting this illegal harassment for the Neighborhood Safety Committee," she said to the camera, as if a committee existed and YouTube would care. "This man is threatening me with an imaginary military convoy. I will not be intimidated." I took a breath. "Proceed," I said into the radio. What happened next was both horrifying and, if I'm honest, a little bit glorious. The first Humvees crested the hill. Karen dropped her phone. Her eyes went wide. The tank came next. A 68-ton behemoth, purring like a giant cat made of steel nightmares. It rolled up behind the Humvees with slow, deliberate grace. Karen screamed something unintelligible and sprinted off the road into the brush, tripping on a yucca plant and landing hard on her clipboard. The tank didn't slow down. It didn't veer. It rolled directly over the Lincoln Navigator, flattening it like a soda can under God's boot. Glass shattered. Tires exploded. The roof crumpled like paper. And then it was over. The tank kept moving, as if it hadn't just committed a vehicular execution. Karen was on her knees now, screaming at the sky, face redder than a chili pepper. "You'll hear from my attorney! This is a war crime! I know my rights!" I climbed out of my truck and walked over to her. "You okay?" I asked. She glared up at me, breath heaving. "That tank destroyed my property." I nodded. "And you were warned?" She looked past me at the conva now rumbling through her imaginary HOA's sacred domain, trailing dust and discipline. "You'll pay for this," she muttered. I gave her a polite smile. "I'm sure I will. After the goats pay their fine." She blinked. I walked off. That night, the ranch buzzed with activity. Floodlights illuminated the fields, military tents popped up like mushrooms, and soldiers moved with silent efficiency. Karen's crumpled Navigator sat half buried in the dirt, a perfect monument to poor decision-making. I briefly considered salvaging it as a lawn ornament. As I sat on my porch with a beer and Gandalf, the goat she'd accused of hostile eye contact, I couldn't help but chuckle. Out here in the wild, Karen had tried to bring suburbia. She brought clipboards to a tank fight. And lost. But I knew Karen. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Karen's meltdown over the obliteration of her Lincoln Navigator became the talk of the county by sundown. It spread like wildfire. Jed, my chicken farming neighbor, claimed he'd heard her scream from 5 miles away. That evening, the sheriff got so many calls, some worried, some entertained, that he stopped by just to make sure I hadn't declared war on the suburbs. I assured him I had not. The war had come to me. He chuckled, tipped his hat, and told me to let him know if Karen tried to organize a militia. By the next morning, the dust had settled, literally and figuratively. The tank had long since rumbled on. The military had moved into their training routine, which included live fire simulations far from the house and some stealthy nighttime drills that startled a few coyotes. Meanwhile, Karen had returned to the scene of the crime, dressed entirely in black like she was attending a funeral for her SUV. She stood in front of the flattened remains with a tape measure, occasionally jotting something down on a legal pad and muttering to herself. I watched her from my porch, coffee in hand, wondering whether she was calculating damages or plotting revenge. Possibly both. Gandalf stood beside me, chewing absently on the hem of my shirt. He seemed unimpressed with Karen's theatrics, though I suspected he was secretly hoping she'd drop another clipboard so he could chew that too. Eventually, Karen marched up to my porch. I could hear her footsteps crunching angrily on the gravel. She held the legal pad like it was a declaration of war. "I have documented everything," she began, voice trembling with either rage or overcaffeination. "I have photographic evidence. I have timestamp footage. And I have contacted the County HOA Board of Appeals." "There is no County HOA Board of Appeals," I replied. "There will be when I'm done with them," she hissed. I took a sip of coffee. "You parked illegally on private property during a scheduled government operation. Your SUV was collateral damage. Not really much to appeal." Karen's face twitched. "You should have warned me. You should have had signs. Permits. Safety cones. Something." "I did," I said, motioning to the bright orange government-issued notice nailed to the oak tree at the road entrance. "Been there a week." She whipped her head toward it, squinted, then turned back. "That doesn't count. That's not an HOA-approved format." "Again," I said, "there's no HOA here." "Yet," she whispered. Later that day, as I drove into town to pick up some feed, the truth behind Karen's so-called authority started unraveling. I stopped by Bonnie's Diner for a burger and ran into Rachel, who owned the local feed store and was one of the few people patient enough to interact with Karen. She leaned across the counter and said, "Hey, did you hear about the fake HOA?" I raised an eyebrow. Fake? Total fiction, Rachel said, sliding me a slice of pecan pie unasked. Karen made the whole thing up. No board. No charter. She printed the bylaws on her home printer. Even fined herself once for leaving a gnome in the front yard just to make it seem real. I stared at her. She fined herself? $25. Then wrote a reimbursement check to herself. It bounced. I chewed slowly, processing that tidbit of madness. So she's just some bored suburban transplant with a clipboard and a god complex? Pretty much. Armed with that information, I returned home and pulled up the security footage from the front gate. Sure enough, the camera had caught Karen several weeks ago sneaking up to the signpost near the road with a hammer, a nail, and a laminated piece of paper labeled HOA vehicle decal requirements. She'd even worn sunglasses and a hoodie like she was breaking into Fort Knox instead of tacking up a bogus rule. That night, as the soldiers prepared for another night of drills, Karen was at it again, this time standing at the edge of the property with a megaphone. She was broadcasting what sounded like a manifesto. This is a cease and desist order issued by the Heartland Oversight Association, a federally unrecognized but morally superior governing body tasked with ensuring neighborhood tranquility. You are in violation of noise ordinances, aesthetic balance, and vehicular appropriateness. I flipped on the porch light. Karen, it's the military. They still have to follow the rules, she barked, then added, I've emailed the Pentagon. The next morning brought an unexpected twist. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up the road, moving smoothly around the wreckage of Karen's Navigator. Out stepped a sharply dressed man in a sleek military uniform, General Stafford. He and I had history, the good kind. Years ago, during a joint project overseas, I'd pulled him out of a bad situation involving a failed extraction, a goat, not Gandalf, and a crate of misfired grenades. We'd kept in touch ever since. We shook hands, exchanged a few quiet words, and then he said something I didn't expect. Is it true this? Karen is threatening to sue the Department of Defense? She's sent at least 5 emails, I said. He chuckled. Most of them in Comic Sans. Karen came storming out of her house, wearing a blazer and yoga pants, waving a folder of documents. Are you with legal? Because I have some concerns about tank accountability. Stafford raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, I'm here to offer you a compromise. Her eyes narrowed. A settlement? A naming opportunity. That made her pause. Excuse me? We're commissioning a new Abrams next month. If you drop all complaints, we'll name it the Karen. We'll even paint it pink. With leopard spots. And a horn that plays a disapproving sigh. She blinked. Why would I want that? You said you wanted to be heard? Karen took a long, conflicted breath. You could almost hear the wheels grinding in her head. Fame. Recognition. A tank that bore her name, charging into mock battles while she got to say she was part of military history. I want final say on the font, she said. Stafford smiled. Deal. And just like that, Karen lowered her folder and turned back toward her house, smug and satisfied. She didn't know the Pentagon was never going to name a real tank after her. It was a mock-up used for training photos and PR stunts. But for now, it bought peace. At least until she found her next cause to crusade over. As for me, I got my road back, the military kept their schedule, and the wreckage of the Navigator remained on the side of the road, now a crumpled trophy of what happens when suburban fantasy meets government reality. Still, I had a feeling Karen's story wasn't over. She'd tasted chaos, and it tasted like Diekoff's soy vanilla aggression. The real question wasn't if she'd stir things up again, it was when. Peace lasted exactly 4 days. Long enough for Karen to sign a non-binding agreement with the Military Public Relations Office, get interviewed by a local lifestyle blogger who misquoted her as Rural Commander of Civility, and post 7 TikToks explaining how she had personally negotiated international tank diplomacy. But quiet never sits long with a woman like Karen. She wasn't just addicted to control, she was fueled by attention, and the slight taste of fame had sent her spiraling into a new delusion, building an actual, monetized, bureaucratic empire out of her imaginary HOA. It began with a freshly printed banner that appeared one morning, flapping from her porch like a declaration of war. It read, Heartland Oversight Association, now serving the greater Tri-County region. Beneath it was a QR code leading to a surprisingly professional website complete with violation submission forms, tiered membership options, and a weekly Community Compliance Digest. She wasn't just role-playing anymore. She had leveled up to full-scale HOA cosplay, with corporate branding and customer support. I would have laughed it off, but then I got an envelope in the mail. A real one, stamped and everything, addressed to Resident Stakeholder. Inside was a bill for $75 for an unregistered structure. It included a grainy aerial photo of my barn taken from a drone and a footnote suggesting I install aesthetic conforming shutters or face escalating penalties. I stood on my porch holding the letter and blinking at it like it was written in Sanskrit. Gandalf trotted over, sniffed it, and promptly pooped on it. That felt like the right response. I took the letter to Jed, who had received 3 violations in one day, one for rooster-related noise, another for improper gnome placement, and a third for owning unpermitted livestock, which was hilarious, given we live in cattle country. Jed just shrugged and said, I ain't paying a damn dime to the HOA lady. But I'll tell you this, she's got folks calling me up asking if I've joined the plan. He tapped his phone. She's recruiting. And she was. Karen launched a campaign with alarming efficiency, canvassing the area, targeting recent landowners, retirees with time, and anyone she deemed too polite to say no. Her strategy was part neighborhood guilt trip, part corporate scam. She wore a badge. She carried a tablet. She offered compliance starter kits. That included yard signs, decal stickers, and a 6-page PDF on rural presentation aesthetics. People started complying, not because they believed, but because it was easier than the barrage of emails, visits, and passive-aggressive notes tied to their mailboxes with pink ribbon. What Karen didn't realize was that her empire had a leak. Her web developer, a bright college student named Maddie, also happened to be my niece. Maddie had taken the job for the money but quickly realized she was helping build a digital dictatorship. She began forwarding me internal emails, messages where Karen outlined fines, enforcement ideas, and a vision board featuring lavender farms, branded uniforms, and a fleet of HOA-branded golf carts. Karen planned to move to Sedona, Arizona, and live off the revenue from the Heartland Oversight Association. She wasn't creating order, she was building her escape pod. Armed with intel, we started chipping away at her illusion. Maddie subtly sabotaged the website. Nothing malicious, just enough to scramble the fine generator, glitch the violation upload system, and replace the official HOA seal with a dancing goat gif for 6 full hours. Karen panicked and sent out a mass email warning of cyber threats from anti-compliance elements, which only made people more suspicious. Meanwhile, I crafted a plan to hit her where it hurt: legitimacy. Karen was organizing what she called a community court, a formal hearing where she would judge HOA violations, deliver rulings, and impose real fines. She sent summons. She built a stage out of pallets. She even rented folding chairs from the VFW. It was scheduled for Saturday morning, under a large pop-up tent on the grassy edge of her property, complete with a podium and 2 officers. She paid in Walmart gift cards. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early, dressed in clean boots and a button-down shirt. In my arms I carried Gandalf, who wore a small black robe, a powdered wig made from cotton balls, and a gavel taped to one horn. Karen stared at us like she'd just swallowed a bug. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "This is my legal counsel," I said, setting Gandalf down gently on the judge's bench, which was really just a crate with a tablecloth on it. "You're mocking the proceedings. You're holding them on my land," I said. "That patch of grass you're standing on? It's part of my property. Surveyor confirmed it years ago. You're trespassing." Her face went pale, then red, then paler. I could see the audience, about 24 people, mostly amused neighbors, watching closely now. "This is highly irregular," she muttered. Gandalf bleated and knocked over a stack of fake citations. One of the folding chairs collapsed under a confused volunteer. Karen tried to recover. "Ladies and gentlemen, please disregard the goat. Let's begin the hearings with—" But the crowd was already laughing. One man shouted, "Let the goat speak!" Another yelled, "Gandalf for president!" Someone started a slow clap. Karen attempted to shout over them, but her voice cracked, and her gavel fell from the podium. Gandalf trotted forward, stepped on it, and pooped triumphantly. The court dissolved in minutes. The fallout came fast. Maddie leaked more of Karen's internal emails, including one where she referred to her members as walking wallets. Someone forwarded them to the local paper. The HOA website was hacked again, this time by a group of teenagers who replaced all her forms with memes of tanks running over SUVs. And then came the IRS letter. It turned out, Karen had been collecting money without registering as a non-profit or a business. Worse, she'd deposited all funds into a personal trust she named after her dog. When the news got out, even the few people who had stuck by her began asking for refunds. She refused. Lawsuits began trickling in. Karen's dream of a lavender farm in Sedona shriveled like an overbaked pot roast. Greg, Karen's mostly silent husband, finally made an appearance. Greg had been absent through most of the drama, choosing instead to live quietly in the garage with his ham radio and bourbon. But the night after the court fiasco, he came by my place. "I'm renting the land to the military," he said, sipping a beer. "She doesn't own the deed. Never did. It was always mine. She just had a lot of opinions." I nodded. "She still does. She'll be real mad. She'll find a new project. She already bought a drone. Says she's gonna inspect rooftops for spiritual violations." I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't want to. But as I looked out over the land, quiet again except for the faint echo of a tank in the distance, I realized something. Karen wasn't just chaos in yoga pants. She was a force of nature. Misguided, yes. Delusional, definitely. But also relentless. And for now, she had been humbled. But deep down, I knew better than to count her out. The convoy rolled in at dawn like a scene from a movie nobody expected to be set in our little stretch of Texas. Helicopters swept across the ridge, their rotors kicking up waves of dust that shimmered in the early light. Armored vehicles moved down the ranch road in perfect formation, the rumble of their engines echoing through the hills like distant thunder. At the head of the convoy, shining under a fresh coat of paint and adorned with pink leopard print decals, came the star of the show, a 68-ton M1 Abrams tank officially dubbed the Karen. They had really done it. The military had followed through with the PR stunt, and somehow, it was even more ridiculous than I imagined. The name, the Karen, was stenciled in cursive near the cannon, and on the rear, in bold white letters, was a slogan that read, "I object." The horn didn't play a disapproving sigh like originally planned, but someone had rigged it to blast a clip of Karen's own voice yelling, "This is an unauthorized action zone." It was surreal, absurd, and beautiful in its own strange way. The military was holding a public appreciation day on my ranch to wrap up the training exercise. Families were invited. There was a barbecue pit the size of a pickup truck, rows of folding chairs, a live country band, and even a bouncy castle for the kids. Soldiers gave tours of the vehicles, explaining their equipment to curious civilians, while volunteers handed out little souvenir helmets and camouflage hats. The atmosphere was festive, light, and somehow managed to make the presence of tanks and helicopters feel charming. Then, as expected, Karen showed up. She arrived in her backup vehicle, a gold-colored Subaru Outback with a dent in the fender and a custom license plate that read H0A4L Wi-Fi. She parked dramatically near the food tent and marched across the field in a crisp navy suit jacket, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard that had become her trademark. Her expression was tight and purposeful, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd actually show up with grace and enjoy the event like everyone else. That hope died when she pulled out a megaphone. "Attention attendees," she announced, her voice cutting across the music like a rusty knife. "This unauthorized military celebration is currently under community review. Please be advised that the Heartland Oversight Association does not recognize this gathering as compliant." People turned. Some squinted. A few laughed. One little boy shouted, "Hey, it's the Tank Lady!" Karen stiffened at the nickname. She pointed her megaphone directly at me. "You, sir, are still in violation of multiple zoning codes and failed to submit a barbecue permit request. Also, your goat is not wearing a leash." Gandalf, standing beside me with a plastic sheriff's badge taped to his fur, blinked slowly and resumed chewing on a hay bale. I walked over, calm as ever. "Karen, this is a federal event. I don't think they need your approval." She glared. "Every event needs structure, order, guidelines. These are my people." "No, Karen," I said, gently nudging her megaphone down. "These are just people. Having a good time. Without laminated violation tags." Before she could respond, a group of kids ran past her, chasing each other with toy tanks. One of them bumped her, and her clipboard fell into a muddy patch near the barbecue pit. The horror on her face was almost theatrical. She scrambled after it, slipped a little, and stood up looking like she had just lost a custody battle against common sense. Then came the porta-potty incident. In a stroke of poetic justice or sheer cosmic timing, Karen decided to regroup inside one of the rented portable toilets. Whether she was trying to fix her makeup or call the mayor again, no one knew. What we do know is that about 3 minutes later, the wind picked up, someone slammed a heavy door too hard, and a rope from the tank's demo tent tangled around the portable unit's handle. Karen was locked inside. At first, nobody noticed. The music played on. Kids bounced in the inflatable tank. The general gave a short speech about community and resilience. It wasn't until someone heard pounding and muffled shouting that we realized where Karen had gone. We didn't rush. Some of us lingered. I won't lie, there was a moment where we all just looked at each other and silently agreed, let her stew a while. She emerged nearly half an hour later, flushed and fuming, toilet paper stuck to her heel and hair frizzed out like she'd fought a wind turbine. She stomped across the field, ignoring the cameras and the laughter. She muttered to herself about lawyers, and insubordination, and environmental violations. But her voice had lost its edge. She wasn't a tyrant anymore. She was a soggy relic of a battle no one else wanted to fight. The tank named after her remained a centerpiece, surrounded by grinning kids and selfie-taking adults. One family even posed beside the nameplate, holding a handmade sign that said, "Thank you, Karen, for teaching us what not to do." By sunset, the crowd began to thin. The soldiers packed up. The band played a few last songs. I sat on the porch of my ranch house with Gandalf beside me and a sweet tea in hand, watching the final glow of the day reflect off the battered remains of Karen's original SUV, which we now painted with the phrase, HOA speed bump. Karen hadn't spoken to me directly since the porta-potty incident, though she had posted several cryptic videos online about the rural resistance movement and patriotic zoning. She also started a YouTube channel titled HOA Realness, where she recorded dramatic readings of bylaws she made up. Surprisingly, she gained a small following, people just as obsessed with overregulation as she was. I subscribed out of morbid curiosity. Maddie, my niece, started commenting on her videos using a fake name and troll-level sarcasm. It was beautiful. Greg, her long-suffering husband, sold a portion of the land shortly after and moved into an RV on the back lot. When I asked him how he was doing, he just raised his beer and said, "Quieter." That was enough. Weeks passed. The ranch returned to normal. The tank was gone, the soldiers moved on, and life settled back into the rhythm of livestock and quiet sunsets. But every now and then, I'd get a letter in the mailbox, some new made-up ordinance, printed in glittery font with official-looking letterhead. I never opened them. Gandalf usually beat me to it. Still, I kept the crumpled clipboard. It hung on the wall of my barn like a trophy. A reminder that you can't stop chaos from knocking, but you sure as hell don't have to invite it inside. And on calm, dusty mornings, when everything was quiet and the goats were behaving and the coffee was just right, I'd look down that road, half expecting to see her gold Subaru again. Clipboard in hand. Ready for another round. Because Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was a phenomenon. And no matter how many tanks rolled through, she wasn't going anywhere.